Pregnant woman gives birth to 15 different animal species. How will this story turn out? To find out, watch the video to the end. But first, please subscribe to my channel and turn on notifications to get more stories like this. The hum of fluorescent lights echoed softly across the hospital hallway, a rhythm as constant as a heartbeat. Nurses moved in a hurried dance, their voices blending with the faint beeping of machines and the muted conversations of family members waiting anxiously outside the emergency room doors. It was, for all intents and purposes, a normal day, a day like any other in a place where life and death intertwined without warning. But today was different. In room 312, Emma lay in a hospital bed, her face pale and glistening with sweat. Her breathing was shallow, her hands trembling as they gripped the sides of the sheets. The doctors and nurses around her moved quickly, but their movements were no longer precise. They were hesitant now, uncertain, shaken by something none of them could have imagined. The lead doctor, Dr. Mallory, stood at the foot of Emma's bed, her face a mask of barely contained disbelief. Her gloved hands hovered in the air, frozen as though she were afraid to move them. She turned to a nurse standing nearby, her voice low and sharp. "Call for more staff," she said urgently. "And get Dr. Chin in here." No. The nurse hesitated, her face pale as she looked at Emma, who groaned softly in pain. "But, doctor, what do we tell him?" Dr. Mallory's gaze snapped to the nurse, her eyes cold. "Tell him it's an emergency. That's all he needs to know." The nurse nodded quickly, slipping out of the room as Dr. Mallory turned her attention back to Emma. The woman on the bed was trembling, her chest rising and falling with labored breaths as tears streaked down her cheeks. Her dark hair clung to her forehead in damp strands, and her hands gripped the bedsheets so tightly her knuckles had turned white. "What's happening to me?" Emma whispered, her voice hoarse and weak. Dr. Mallory stepped closer, forcing her face into something that resembled calm. "You're doing great, Emma," she said gently, though her voice trembled slightly. "We're going to figure this out. Just try to breathe, okay? And out. That's it." Emma let out a shaky breath, her eyes wide and glassy as she stared at the ceiling. "Something's wrong," she whispered. "I know it. This isn't normal." Dr. Mallory didn't respond. How could she? Nothing about this was normal. The door to the room swung open, and Dr. Chin entered, his face creased with concern as he glanced at the monitors beeping beside Emma's bed. "What's going on?" he asked quickly, moving to stand beside Dr. Mallory. "I was told it was urgent." Dr. Mallory didn't look at him as she spoke. "You need to see for yourself," she said quietly. Dr. Chin frowned, his brow furrowing as he stepped closer to the foot of the bed. "Vitals?" he asked, his tone clipped. "Stable for now," Dr. Mallory replied. "But that's not the issue." Before Dr. Chin could respond, Emma let out a sharp cry, her body tensing as another contraction gripped her. The doctors moved quickly, their hands working in a flurry of motion as they prepared for what came next. But as the contraction subsided, Emma's body went still, and the room fell silent. For a moment, no one moved. Then a soft sound, a faint whimper, filled the air. Dr. Chin froze, his face paling as his gaze dropped to the blanket covering Emma's legs. Slowly, he pulled the blanket back, his hands trembling. The room fell deathly silent, save for the soft, broken gasp that escaped from Dr. Chen's lips. It wasn't a baby. Lying in the space where a newborn should have been was something far smaller and far stranger. A tiny, trembling animal curled into itself, its fur damp and matted. It let out a faint squeak, its eyes barely open as it squirmed weakly against the sheets. "A fox," one of the nurses whispered, her voice breaking. Dr. Mallory stepped back as though the creature might bite her, her face pale. "What is this?" she breathed. Emma's eyes fluttered open, her face still contorted in pain as she looked at the doctors hovering at the foot of her bed. "What's happening?" she asked weakly. "Why aren't you saying anything?" Dr. Chin turned to her, his face a mix of confusion and terror. "Emma," he said slowly, his voice trembling, "did you know you were pregnant with an animal?" Emma blinked, her expression clouding with confusion. "What are you talking about?" she whispered. "What animal?" Dr. Chin hesitated before gesturing to the tiny fox resting in the blankets at the foot of the bed. Emma's gaze followed his movement, and her breath caught in her throat. "No," she whispered, her voice breaking. "No, that's not possible." Dr. Mallory stepped closer, her voice urgent. "Emma, listen to me. We don't know what's happening, but we need to figure this out. Do you remember anything unusual about your pregnancy? Any strange symptoms?" Emma's gaze remained fixed on the small fox, her eyes wide and unblinking. "No," she said faintly. "I mean, yes, I was sick more often than I should have been. Felt heavy, like something was wrong. But no one believed me. They said everything was normal." Dr. Chen turned to Dr. Mallory, his voice low and tense. "We need to get her to imaging. This doesn't make sense." Before Dr. Mallory could respond, Emma let out another sharp cry, her body tensing once more as another contraction ripped through her. The doctors moved quickly, their fear pushed aside as they prepared for whatever was coming next. Moments later, the room fell silent again. Another whimper filled the air, this time louder, stronger. Dr. Chen looked down, his face pale as he reached for the blanket once more. He hesitated, his hands trembling, before pulling it back. The room erupted into chaos. A leopard cub lay nestled beside the tiny fox, its spotted fur slick and its small body quivering. The nurses gasped, one of them stumbling back and pressing her hands to her mouth as she tried to contain a scream. Dr. Mallory spun toward Dr. Chen, her voice sharp. "What is happening?" Dr. Chen shook his head, his face blank with shock. "This isn't possible," he whispered. Emma's head lolled to the side as tears streamed down her face. "What's wrong with me?" she choked out. "Please, someone tell me what's happening." No one had an answer. The doctors stood frozen, their minds unable to process what they were seeing. In the space of mere minutes, Emma had given birth to not one, but two animals, creatures that had no business being anywhere near a hospital bed. And it wasn't over. Another contraction hit, harder this time. Emma cried out, her hands clutching at the sheets as her body tensed once more. Dr. Mallory and Dr. Chen exchanged a look, one filled with fear and uncertainty, before turning their attention back to Emma. "Breathe, Emma," Dr. Mallory said softly, though her voice wavered. "Just breathe. We're here. We'll figure this out." But as the minutes passed and the impossible continued to unfold, one thing became clear. This was not something anyone could explain. By the time the clock on the wall read noon, Emma lay still and silent, her body spent and trembling as tears slid down her cheeks. The bed was surrounded now, not by the usual chaos of medical equipment and nurses, but by small, trembling animals. A wolf pup nestled beside the leopard cub. A raccoon squirmed at Emma's feet. Tiny birds chirped softly, their wings tucked close to their bodies as they rested against the folds of the blanket. The room was silent, save for the sound of soft whimpers and the quiet, broken sobs that escaped from Emma's lips. Dr. Chen turned to Dr. Mallory, his voice low and shaky. "What do we do now?" Dr. Mallory stared at the scene before her face pale and her expression unreadable. "I don't know," she whispered. Outside the room, the hallway had gone quiet. The nurses who had been rushing through moments earlier now stood frozen, their faces pressed against the small window in the door as they stared at the impossible sight unfolding inside. Whispers ran through the crowd like wildfire. "She's giving birth to animals," someone murmured. "That's not possible," another replied. But as the minutes passed and the animals continued to arrive, there was no denying the truth. Something was happening in room 312, something no one could explain. And Emma, lying in the center of it all, had become the focus of a story that would change everything. Emma stared blankly at the ceiling as the room spun around her. She felt numb, her body drained of every ounce of strength she had. Her breathing was ragged, shallow, her chest rising and falling as tears streaked down her face. The soft sounds of whimpers and chirps filled the silence, and when she glanced down toward her trembling legs, her breath caught again. Animals. Foxes. Birds. A leopard cub. She squeezed her eyes shut, willing herself to wake up. This had to be a nightmare, a surreal, terrifying dream that her exhausted mind had conjured. But when she opened her eyes, the impossible reality remained. The tiny creatures nestled against her skin, some curling in on themselves as though drawn to her warmth, others shifting slightly with faint squeaks or sighs. "This isn't real," Emma whispered to herself. "This can't be real." Dr. Mallory's voice broke through the surreal silence, shaky but urgent. "We need more staff in here," she said sharply. "We need to contain this. And someone get the hospital director on the phone, now." One of the nurses, her face pale and hands trembling, glanced at Dr. Mallory. Should we move the animals?" she asked hesitantly. Dr. Mallory's eyes flicked to the cluster of creatures surrounding Emma. She hesitated, fear flashing across her face for just a second before she steadied herself. "No," she said firmly. "We don't know what we're dealing with here. Let's not make it worse." Emma turned her head weakly toward the doctor, her voice barely above a whisper. "Worse," she choked out. "How could it get any worse?" Dr. Chin, who had remained frozen for far too long, finally sprang into action. He moved quickly to Emma's side, his face pale but determined as he checked the monitors attached to her body. "Emma," he said softly, his voice calm despite the chaos swirling around them, "I need you to focus on me, okay? I know this is strange, but you need to stay calm. Can you do that?" Emma let out a bitter, broken laugh, her head falling back against the pillow. "Stay calm," she repeated, her voice shaking. "You want me to stay calm? I've just given birth to..." Her voice broke, and tears streamed down her face again. "To animals," she whispered. Dr. Chin swallowed hard, nodding slowly. "I know," he said gently, "and we're going to figure out what's happening. But we need you to trust us right now, okay?" Emma didn't respond. Her gaze dropped again to the animals surrounding her, and her lip trembled as she took in the sight of them. The tiny fox was sleeping now, curled up near her knee, while the leopard cub nestled against her thigh, its spotted fur rising and falling with tiny, rhythmic breaths. The wolf pup was twitching in its sleep, its soft whimpers sending chills down her spine. How could this be real? The door to the room swung open again, breaking the fragile stillness. The hospital director, a tall man in his 50s with graying hair and a stern expression, entered the room, flanked by 2 more doctors and a handful of nurses. He stopped short as his gaze landed on the scene before him, Emma, pale and trembling in the bed, surrounded by the impossible. His face went white. "What?" he began slowly, his voice low and filled with disbelief, "is going on here?" Dr. Mallory turned to face him, her face tight and serious. "We don't know yet," she said quietly. "But it's real. We've seen it happen." The director's gaze flicked to Dr. Chin, as though searching for confirmation. Dr. Chin nodded slowly, his expression grim. "It's real," he said. "We've delivered multiple animals over the past hour. All alive." The director's eyes narrowed, his face darkening with something Emma couldn't place: anger, fear, confusion, maybe all 3. "This isn't possible," he snapped, his voice rising. "There has to be an explanation. You've run tests?" "We're running tests now," Dr. Mallory replied, gesturing toward the monitors and machines hooked up to Emma. "But so far, nothing makes sense. Her vitals are normal. The animals are alive and healthy. There's no medical explanation." The director's gaze turned to Emma, and for a moment, she thought she saw something like pity flash across his face. "And the patient?" he asked quietly. Emma blinked at him, her face pale and streaked with tears. "The patient is sitting right here," she said bitterly. The director's mouth tightened, and he stepped closer to the bed. "Emma," he said carefully, "can you tell us anything about what's happening? Anything unusual about your pregnancy?" Emma let out a shaky breath, her body trembling as she spoke. "I told the doctors something was wrong," she said quietly. "From the beginning, I told them. The weight, the sickness, I felt it wasn't normal." She paused, swallowing hard as the memory surfaced. "And then there were the dreams." Dr. Chin frowned, stepping closer. "Dreams?" he repeated. Emma nodded, her hands trembling as she gripped the blanket tightly against her chest. "For months now, I've been having these dreams," she whispered. "I didn't tell anyone because I thought they were just dreams. But now..." Her voice caught and she shook her head. "What kind of dreams?" Dr. Mallory pressed gently. Emma's gaze dropped to the leopard cub sleeping peacefully near her leg. "Animals," she whispered. "I kept seeing animals in the forest. tigers, wolves, foxes. They would gather around me, and I'd hear them whispering things I couldn't understand. It felt so real. The director and the doctors exchanged uneasy glances. Hallucinations, maybe, the director muttered. Some kind of psychosis? It wasn't psychosis, Emma said sharply, her voice trembling with frustration. I know what I saw. They were real. I could feel them. And now, she gestured helplessly to the animals surrounding her, tears streaming down her face. Now they're here. Tell me how that's possible. No one answered. The silence was broken only by the soft sounds of the animals, who seemed utterly unbothered by the chaos around them. The raccoon stretched lazily, letting out a tiny yawn before curling back into itself. The fox twitched in its sleep, its fur rising and falling with calm, steady breaths. Dr. Chen cleared his throat, his voice low and steady as he addressed the room. We need to focus, he said firmly. We don't have answers yet, but we need to figure this out, fast. These animals are alive, and Emma is stable for now, but we don't know what's coming next. The director nodded slowly, though his face remained pale. Keep running tests, he said curtly. I want every specialist we have brought in on this. Biologists, geneticists, anyone who might know what we're dealing with. What about the media? One of the nurses asked hesitantly, her voice breaking. There are already people gathering outside the hospital. Someone must have leaked what's happening. The director's face darkened, and he shook his head. Lock this down. I don't want anyone else getting near this room. He turned back to Emma, his expression unreadable. Until we understand what's happening here, this stays between us. Emma let out a shaky breath, her body trembling as she glanced again at the animals surrounding her. The fox, the raccoon, the leopard cub, all of them so small, so impossibly fragile. Her heart ached as she stared at them, a strange sense of protectiveness swelling in her chest. I don't want them hurt, she whispered suddenly, her voice trembling. Dr. Mallory turned to her, frowning. What? Emma's gaze lifted to meet the doctor's eyes, her expression fierce despite the tears on her face. The animals, she said firmly. I don't want anyone hurting them. Promise me. Dr. Chen hesitated, exchanging a glance with Dr. Mallory before nodding slowly. We'll do our best, he said quietly. Emma didn't look convinced, but she didn't argue. She leaned back against the pillow, her body aching and her mind spinning. Outside the hospital room, she could hear the faint sound of voices, murmurs of fear and curiosity as word of the impossible event spread like wildfire. And as she closed her eyes, the dreams returned. A forest. A clearing. Animals gathering around her, their eyes glowing with something ancient and unspoken. She could hear them whispering again, their voices soft and rhythmic, though the words were still just out of reach. And somewhere deep in her chest, Emma knew the truth. This was only the beginning. Emma woke with a start, the image of the animals surrounding her still lingering in her mind like a shadow. Her heart raced as her eyes darted around the hospital room, taking in the surreal sight before her. It wasn't a dream. The fox was still curled against her leg, its soft fur rising and falling in rhythm with its gentle breaths. The leopard cub, slightly larger now, stretched lazily and let out a faint yawn, its small teeth visible for just a moment. The wolf pup nestled closer to the blanket, making a soft whining sound as it stirred. She swallowed hard, her throat dry, as she glanced up toward the doctors and nurses gathered at the far corner of the room. They were speaking in low, urgent voices, their gazes flicking toward her every so often. Emma could hear bits and pieces of the conversation, though none of it made sense. Genetic anomaly. Nothing in the blood work. Impossible, should be dead. She shifted slightly, the movement drawing their attention. Dr. Mallory turned first, her expression one of poorly hidden exhaustion. Emma, she said carefully, stepping closer to the bed, how are you feeling? Emma blinked at her, unsure how to answer. How could anyone feel after something like this? Her body ached in places she didn't know existed, her mind was a haze of confusion and fear, and her heart was thundering in her chest like it might burst. She licked her lips, her voice hoarse. I don't know, she whispered. It's like I'm not in my own body anymore. Dr. Mallory nodded, though Emma could see the flicker of unease in her eyes. Your vitals are stable, she said, as though trying to reassure herself as much as Emma. That's a good sign. Emma let out a shaky breath, glancing down again at the animals. Her voice trembled. And them? Are they okay? Dr. Mallory hesitated, turning to exchange a glance with Dr. Chin, who stood nearby. Finally, he stepped forward, his expression unreadable. Physically, the animals are fine, he said slowly as though carefully choosing his words. In fact, they're remarkably healthy, stronger than any newborn creature we've seen. Emma's brows furrowed. What do you mean? Dr. Chin sighed, his shoulders slumping slightly. We ran some tests, basic vitals, genetic sequencing. The animals are normal on the surface. They have functioning organs, healthy body weight, and no obvious abnormalities. But, he paused, shaking his head. But they're not normal, Emma. Their DNA? There's something strange about it. It doesn't match any known species perfectly. Emma stared at him, her breath catching. What are you saying? Dr. Mallory stepped forward, her face grave. We're saying that these animals, whatever they are, aren't just animals. There's something else. Something we've never seen before. The words hit Emma like a punch to the gut. She shook her head, her breathing growing faster. No, she said weakly. That's not possible. They're just animals. Look at them. She gestured toward the fox and the leopard cub, their tiny bodies peaceful and innocent against the stark white hospital sheets. They looked so fragile, so real, that it was impossible to believe they were anything other than what they appeared to be. And yet, deep down, Emma couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling in her gut. There was something about them, something in the way they moved, the way their eyes gleamed with a strange intelligence, that felt off. Dr. Chin spoke again, his voice quiet. Emma, we need to know everything you can tell us about your pregnancy. Anything unusual you might have experienced, anything at all. Emma stared at him, her mind spinning. Her dreams, the whispers, the impossible weight that had pressed down on her every day for months. Slowly, she shook her head. I already told you. The dreams started months ago. The animals, tigers, foxes, wolves, they would gather around me. I thought they were just dreams. But what? Dr. Mallory pressed. Emma swallowed hard, tears pricking her eyes. There was a forest, she said softly, her voice trembling. I don't know where it was. It felt ancient, like something out of a storybook. The trees were massive, their roots twisted together like they were alive. And the animals, they weren't afraid of me. They were waiting for me. Dr. Mallory frowned, scribbling something onto the chart she held. Did anything else happen? Anything that could have triggered this? Emma closed her eyes, searching her memories. Flashes of the dreams swirled through her mind, the glowing eyes of the animals, the strange whispers in a language she didn't understand. And then, she gasped, her eyes flying open. The mark, she said suddenly, her voice shaking. Dr. Chin leaned forward, his brow furrowed. What mark? Emma reached for the hem of her hospital gown, her hands trembling as she pulled it up slightly to reveal her abdomen. There, just above her hip, was a faint mark, barely visible against her pale skin. It looked almost like a birthmark, except that it was perfectly symmetrical, shaped like a twisting vine or a tree branch. Dr. Mallory sucked in a sharp breath. That wasn't there before, she said quietly. Emma shook her head, her voice barely a whisper. It appeared a few weeks after the dream started. I didn't think much of it at the time, but... Dr. Chin stepped closer, his expression unreadable as he studied the mark. It's not a scar, he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. And it doesn't look natural. Almost like... He trailed off, shaking his head. Almost like what? Emma demanded, her voice rising in panic. Dr. Chin hesitated, glancing at Dr. Mallory before speaking. Almost like it was placed there, he said softly. Emma's heart raced, her mind spinning with 1,000 questions. What does that mean? She whispered. Placed there by who? Before anyone could answer, a nurse burst into the room, her face pale and her eyes wide with panic. Doctor, she gasped, her voice trembling. You need to see this. Dr. Mallory frowned, turning to face her. What is it? The nurse swallowed hard, glancing nervously toward Emma. The animals, she said faintly. Either changing. The room went silent. Dr. Chen was the first to react, stepping toward the nurse with a frown. What do you mean, changing? The nurse shook her head, her voice barely more than a whisper. You need to come see for yourself. Without another word, Dr. Mallory and Dr. Chen hurried out of the room, leaving Emma alone with the nurse and the small, sleeping animals. The quiet that followed was deafening, broken only by the faint beeping of the monitors and the sound of Emma's ragged breathing. What's happening? Emma whispered, her voice trembling. The nurse didn't answer. She simply stood near the door, her hands clenched tightly at her sides as though she were afraid to move. Emma's gaze dropped to the animals surrounding her, and her breath caught in her throat. The fox twitched, its body shifting slightly beneath the blanket. The raccoon stirred, its small limbs stretching as it let out a faint, unnatural sound, something that didn't belong to any animal Emma had ever heard. The leopard cub, once so still, raised its head and stared at her, its golden eyes glowing faintly in the dim light of the room. Emma's heart pounded in her chest as she stared back at the cub, unable to look away. What are you? She whispered. The cub blinked slowly, its gaze unblinking and strangely intelligent. For a long moment, it didn't move. Then, without warning, it opened its mouth and let out a sound, a low, rumbling growl that sent chills racing down Emma's spine. The nurse let out a soft gasp, stumbling back toward the door. Doctor, she called out again, her voice breaking. We need help in here. But Emma barely heard her. Her entire body had gone cold as the room around her seemed to shift, the air growing heavy and electric. The leopard cub continued to stare at her, its gaze unrelenting, and for the first time, Emma felt it, a connection. The whispers returned, faint but insistent, echoing in the back of her mind like a song she couldn't quite hear. She clutched the sheets tightly, her voice shaking as she spoke. What do you want from me? The cub blinked again, its growl fading into silence. And then, as though answering her question, the dreams came flooding back. The forest, the animals, the strange mark on her skin. And through it all, one thought rose above the rest, as clear and unshakable as a bell. This is only the beginning. The hospital room buzzed with an eerie stillness, a silence that clung to the air like fog. Emma's chest rose and fell in shallow, uneven breaths as she stared at the leopard cub's glowing eyes, transfixed by the faint, unnatural light they emitted. It was impossible, everything about this was impossible. Yet the animals were here, real, alive, and changing. She reached out with trembling fingers, drawn by something she couldn't explain. Her hand hovered above the cub's head for just a moment, her instincts warring within her, fear on one side, curiosity on the other. Then the connection deepened. The whispers in her head grew louder, swirling in her mind like a chorus of voices speaking in a language she didn't understand. The leopard cub blinked, its golden eyes softening as it tilted its head. It looked at her like it knew her, like it recognized her. The door burst open. Dr. Mallory and Dr. Chen rushed back into the room, followed closely by a team of nurses and an unfamiliar man in a dark suit. Emma jerked her hand back, snapping out of the trance, her heart pounding wildly in her chest. Move aside, the man in the suit barked, his voice sharp and commanding. His slicked back hair and the badge clipped to his belt made him look more like an agent than a doctor. He surveyed the room quickly, his gaze falling on Emma and the animals gathered around her. His expression flickered, just for a second, with something that looked like shock, but it was gone so quickly Emma almost missed it. Who are you? Emma demanded, her voice hoarse as she hugged her arms protectively around herself. The man turned to Dr. Mallory without answering, his expression tight. Is this the patient? Dr. Mallory nodded, clearly flustered. Yes. This is Emma Callahan. She's been delivering these animals. I can see that. The man cut her off, his voice clipped. He turned his cold gaze back to Emma, studying her as though she were some kind of experiment. How many so far? Dr. Chen stepped forward, his voice hesitant. 15. The man's eyes narrowed. 15. He said the word slowly, as though testing it on his tongue. And there have been no fatalities? All are alive? Yes, Dr. Mallory replied, her voice barely above a whisper. They're healthy. That's part of what makes this so So impossible. The man didn't respond. He stepped closer to the bed, ignoring the quiet sounds of the animals as they shifted restlessly against the sheets. Emma shrank back instinctively, her hands trembling as she clutched the blanket tightly around her. "Stay away from me," she said sharply. The man stopped, his eyes cold and unreadable as he stared at her. "You have no idea what's happening to you, do you?" he asked softly, almost mockingly. Emma's heart pounded in her chest as anger rose to the surface, sharp and hot. "No," she snapped. "Because no one will tell me. All you people do is look at me like I'm some kind of freak." Dr. Chen stepped forward, his voice firm but gentle. "Emma, we're trying to help you. But we need to understand what's happening here. This man is... I don't care who he is." Emma cut him off, her voice shaking. "I don't trust him." The man in the suit smiled faintly, though there was no warmth in it. "You should trust me," he said quietly. "Because I'm the only one who can give you answers." Emma glared at him, her breathing uneven as her gaze darted to Dr. Mallory and Dr. Chen. "And what makes him so special?" Dr. Mallory hesitated, glancing nervously at the man before answering. "He's from the government, Emma," she said softly. "They were notified when this began happening. They're here to investigate." "The government?" Emma repeated, her voice cracking. "Why?" The man's faint smile faded, replaced by a steely seriousness. "Because what's happening to you isn't normal," he said. "And it's not random." The words sent a chill racing through Emma's spine. She swallowed hard, her voice trembling as she spoke. "What do you mean? What's happening to me?" The man didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached into the pocket of his suit and pulled out a small, black tablet. He tapped the screen a few times before holding it up for her to see. The image on the screen made Emma's breath catch. It was the mark. The same mark that had appeared on her hip weeks ago. Perfectly symmetrical, twisting like vines into something both beautiful and ominous. But this time, the mark was not on her skin. It was carved into stone, a massive stone structure, half buried beneath a thick canopy of trees. The picture looked old, the edges of the stone worn with time, but the mark itself remained clear, glowing faintly in the dim light of the forest. "This is the forest of Kara," the man said, his voice low. "A place hidden deep in the mountains, sacred land that hasn't been touched in centuries." Emma's hands trembled as she stared at the image, her heart pounding. "I don't understand. What does this have to do with me?" The man's eyes narrowed slightly. "You said you've been dreaming of a forest. Animals. A connection you can't explain." Emma nodded slowly, her voice faint. "Yes. That's because you've been called," the man said simply. "Whether you realize it or not, something ancient, something tied to that land, has chosen you." "Chosen me for what?" Emma whispered, tears welling in her eyes. "To bring life back into balance," he said, his voice steady and unrelenting. "Those animals you've given birth to, they're not just animals. They're symbols. Representations of the natural order. Each one is tied to something greater, something older than any of us." Emma shook her head, her body trembling. "No," she whispered. "That doesn't make sense. I'm not special." The man's expression softened slightly, though his tone remained firm. "That's not for you to decide," he said quietly. "The mark chose you. The dreams chose you. And now, the animals are here because of you." Emma clutched the blanket tighter, her voice cracking with desperation. "I don't want this," she whispered. "I just want to be normal." "Normal?" The man shook his head. "What's happening here isn't normal, Emma. It's extraordinary. You are a vessel, one the world has been waiting for." Emma stared at him, her mind spinning. A vessel? A symbol? How could she be any of those things? She was just a woman, just Emma. But the animals, the glowing eyes, the whispers, they knew her. They had chosen her. Dr. Chen stepped forward, his voice soft. "Emma," he said gently, "I know this is hard to accept. But the animals, they're drawn to you. They trust you. And whatever's happening here, you're a part of it." Emma turned her gaze to the animals again, her tears blurring the sight of them. The fox stirred in its sleep, its tiny nose twitching as though it could sense her. The leopard cub watched her still, its golden eyes unblinking, and the wolf pup let out a faint whine, shifting closer to the warmth of her body. For the first time since this nightmare had begun, Emma felt something shift inside her. It wasn't fear or anger or confusion. It was understanding. She looked back up at the man in the suit, her voice soft but steady. "What happens now?" The man smiled faintly, his expression inscrutable. "Now we prepare." "Prepare for what?" The man's eyes darkened slightly, the faintest hint of unease flickering across his face. "For what comes next?" Emma stared at him, her heart pounding as the whispers returned once more, louder now, stronger. The forest. The animals. It was all connected, and deep down she knew the truth. This wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. The silence in the room pressed down on Emma like a physical weight, heavy and suffocating. The man in the suit stood still, his dark gaze fixed on her, while Dr. Mallory and Dr. Chen exchanged nervous glances. The animals surrounding Emma, the fox, the leopard cub, the wolf pup, seemed oblivious to the tension, their bodies relaxed and calm as though nothing extraordinary had happened. But it was extraordinary. Emma's fingers curled into the blanket, her knuckles white as she tried to steady her breathing. The words the man had spoken echoed in her mind, bouncing off the walls of her consciousness like a trapped bird. "You've been called. You are a vessel. Prepare for what comes next." The phrases made her head spin. How could she, an ordinary woman, a school teacher from a quiet town, be chosen for something like this? How could anyone make sense of what was happening? "What do you mean, prepare?" Emma's voice trembled as she spoke, but there was a new edge to it, a quiet determination that hadn't been there before. "What exactly am I supposed to be preparing for?" The man in the suit tilted his head slightly, his face unreadable. "The balance has been disrupted," he said carefully, as though explaining something to a child. "Nature itself is responding. You are the bridge, the link between the old and the new." "The old and the new?" Emma shook her head, frustration bubbling to the surface. "Stop speaking in riddles and tell me what that means. What am I supposed to do?" The man's gaze softened, though only slightly. "It's not about what you do, Emma. It's about what you are." The words sent chills racing down her spine. She stared at him, her breathing quick and shallow as her mind raced. "And if I don't want to be this bridge?" she asked, her voice cracking. "If I don't want any part of this?" The man didn't respond right away. He glanced down at the animals curled against her, his gaze lingering on the leopard cub with its glowing golden eyes. "Wanting doesn't matter," he said softly. "The choice was never yours to make." Emma's body stiffened, anger flaring in her chest. "That's not fair," she whispered. "Fairness has nothing to do with it," the man replied, his voice flat. "This is bigger than you, Emma. Bigger than any of us." Dr. Chen stepped forward then, his voice hesitant but steady. "What exactly is the balance you keep talking about?" he asked. "Are you suggesting that these animals, these creatures, are tied to something cosmic? Spiritual?" The man turned to him, his dark eyes narrowing slightly. "Call it whatever you want," he said. "Spiritual, natural, divine. It doesn't matter. The truth is, the world has fallen out of harmony, and this woman," he gestured toward Emma, his gaze unwavering, "is at the center of restoring it." Emma shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. "Why me?" she whispered again. "What did I do to deserve this?" The man didn't answer, but the look in his eyes told her all she needed to know. This wasn't about deserving. The soft sound of movement drew Emma's attention downward. The leopard cub had stretched, its small body shifting closer to her, and for the first time, it let out a faint purr, a sound that shouldn't have been possible for a newborn creature. It looked up at her with its glowing eyes, and for a moment, Emma felt the connection again, deep and unshakable. She reached out slowly, her fingers brushing against the cub's soft fur. A warmth bloomed in her chest, spreading outward like sunlight breaking through clouds. The whispers in her mind grew louder, but this time, they didn't frighten her. They comforted her. Dr. Mallory watched the scene unfold with wide eyes, her voice barely above a whisper as she turned to the man in the suit. "What happens now?" The man glanced at her briefly before looking back at Emma. "We take her?" Emma's head snapped up, her heart skipping a beat. "What?" The man stepped closer, his expression cold and unrelenting. "You can't stay here, Emma. This hospital, this town, they're not safe anymore. Word is already spreading. The people out there won't understand what you are, and they won't care. You need to come with us." Emma's heart pounded in her chest as panic rose to the surface. "No," she said sharply, shaking her head. "I'm not going anywhere with you." "You don't have a choice," the man replied, his tone flat. "If you stay here, you're putting everyone around you in danger, including yourself." "Danger?" Dr. Chen interjected, frowning. "What kind of danger are you talking about?" The man turned to him, his expression grim. "There are others who would see this woman destroyed," he said. "Others who would stop at nothing to control or silence her." Emma's breath caught in her throat. "Why?" "Because what's happening to you is unprecedented," the man replied. "You are a force of nature, Emma, a living miracle. But miracles are often feared, misunderstood, and exploited." The words hit her like a physical blow. She looked around the room, her gaze darting from Dr. Mallory to Dr. Chen to the nurses standing frozen by the door. None of this made sense. She didn't feel like a miracle. She felt broken, confused, and terrified. "I'm not leaving," she said firmly, her voice trembling. "This is my life. My body. You can't just take me." The man's expression hardened. "If you stay, they'll come for you." "Who?" Emma demanded, her voice rising in desperation. "Who are they?" The man didn't answer. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, black device. Something that looked like a pager but glowed faintly with blue light. He pressed a button on its side, and almost immediately, the sound of footsteps echoed in the hallway outside the room. "What are you doing?" Emma's voice shook as the door opened and two more men entered, both wearing the same dark suits and unreadable expressions. They flanked the bed like guards, their eyes fixed on her. "Emma," the man said softly, "you don't have to be afraid. We're here to protect you." "I don't need your protection," she shouted, panic rising like a tidal wave. She clutched the blanket tighter around herself, her hands trembling. "I just want to go home." Dr. Mallory stepped forward then, placing herself between Emma and the men. "This isn't right," she said sharply. "You can't force her to go with you." The man in the suit turned his cold gaze to Dr. Mallory. "We're not forcing her to do anything. We're saving her life and yours." Emma's breath came in ragged gasps as the walls of the room seemed to close in around her. The animals surrounding her stirred restlessly, as though sensing her distress. The wolf pup let out a low, whining sound, and the leopard cub hissed softly, its small body tensing. The whispers in Emma's mind grew louder, the words still foreign but urgent, insistent. A sudden surge of energy raced through her veins, sharp and electric, and for a moment, the world around her seemed to slow. "No," she whispered, her voice trembling but fierce. "You're not taking me." The man in the suit frowned, opening his mouth to speak, but before he could say a word, the animals erupted into motion. The fox sprang to its feet, letting out a sharp bark that echoed through the room. The leopard cub hissed again, its fur bristling, while the wolf pup growled low in its throat, its tiny teeth bared. The air in the room seemed to shift, growing thick and heavy with an energy Emma couldn't explain. The men in suits froze, their eyes widening as they stared at the animals. "What?" Before they could react, the lights overhead flickered and went out, plunging the room into darkness. The monitors beeped wildly, their alarms shrieking as chaos erupted. Emma's heart pounded in her chest as she felt the whispers crescendo into a roar, filling her mind with a single, clear message. The lights flickered back on for just a second, and in that moment, Emma saw the animals, no longer small or helpless but powerful, fierce, and glowing with an unnatural light. The fox snarled, the wolf pup barked, and the leopard cub lunged toward one of the men, its claws extended. The room exploded into screams and shouts as the men stumbled back, chaos swallowing them whole. And in the center of it all, Emma moved. Before Dr. Chen could respond, the forest seemed to shift. The trees rustled again, their ancient branches groaning softly as though urging him to move. The glowing flowers brightened, pulsing gently in rhythm with the hum that vibrated through the clearing. The fox turned toward the trees, its golden eyes glancing back at Emma before it trotted forward, slipping silently into the shadows. The wolf pup followed, its soft tail wagging as it disappeared behind the fox. The leopard cub was last to move, pausing only to look up at Emma one last time. Its gaze lingered, almost as though it understood the gravity of this moment, before it turned and padded silently into the woods. Dr. Chen took a shaky step forward, reaching out as though to stop her. "Emma, wait." But Emma didn't follow the animals. Not yet. She turned back to Dr. Chen, her gaze calm and steady, her body bathed in the faint glow of the forest. "You don't have to worry about me anymore," she said softly, her voice steady despite the emotion in her eyes. "I belong here now." Dr. Chen's expression crumbled. "Emma, please, you can't just stay here. Let me help you. Let us help you." Emma shook her head, her voice filled with quiet resolve. "You have helped me," she replied. "More than you know. But this is where I need to be." Dr. Chen's hands fell to his sides, defeat washing over him as he realized there was nothing more he could do. His throat tightened as he forced himself to speak. "What do I tell them?" he whispered. "What do I tell the world when they ask what happened to you?" Emma's smile was faint but warm. "Tell them the truth," she said. "Tell them I found peace." A tear slipped down Dr. Chen's cheek, and he quickly wiped it away, turning his face so she wouldn't see. He took one last look at her, at the woman he had fought so hard to understand, the woman who had somehow become something far greater than anyone could have imagined. "Goodbye, Emma," he said softly, his voice breaking. Emma nodded, her smile bittersweet. "Goodbye." Dr. Chen hesitated for a moment longer before turning and walking back toward the edge of the clearing. The forest seemed to guide him, the faint glow of the flowers lighting his path as he moved away. Emma watched him go, her heart heavy but calm. As soon as he disappeared from sight, the clearing shifted again. The air grew warmer, the energy around her stronger, and Emma felt the hum of the forest settle deep within her chest. She turned back toward the stone structure, her gaze falling on the glowing mark carved into its surface. It was waiting for her. She stepped forward, the moss soft beneath her bare feet. The forest seemed to hold its breath, the silence broken only by the faint whispers that flowed through her mind like a gentle breeze. The mark on her hip burned faintly, its warmth spreading outward until it filled her entire being. When she reached the stone, she knelt beside it, placing her hands flat against its surface. The hum in the air grew louder, resonating with the beat of her own heart. For the first time since this had begun, Emma felt whole. The whispers spoke again, their voices clear and strong. "You are the bridge. The balance has been restored." Emma closed her eyes, tears sliding down her cheeks as she whispered, "Thank you." The forest responded. Light spilled from the stone, rising in golden streams that swirled around her like ribbons of energy. The ground beneath her trembled softly, the trees bowing as though paying their respects. The air was alive, humming with the power of something ancient and eternal. The mark on her hip pulsed once, twice, then faded. The whispers grew quiet, their message complete. When Emma opened her eyes, the clearing was still. The stone was silent, its glow gone. The air was calm, the forest at peace. She stood slowly, her body light, her mind clear. The animals were gone now, at least in form, but she could still feel them, their presence lingering in her chest like a memory. She took a deep breath, letting the forest fill her lungs. For the first time in months, there was no fear, no confusion, only peace. Far away, back in the hospital, Dr. Chen stumbled through the stairwell door, his heart pounding in his chest. The bright, sterile light of the hallway felt jarring after the warmth of the forest, but he didn't stop. Nurses turned to stare at him as he walked, completing the journey he had begun hours ago. For the first time in his career, he knew that not everything needed to be understood, categorized, or explained. Some things simply existed beyond reason. Days passed, and the hospital returned to its routine. The chaos that had surrounded Emma's case became whispers, then rumors, and finally faded into silence. Official reports gave no clear answers, no explanations about the animals, the glowing mark, or Emma's disappearance. The hospital administration claimed it was an anomaly and a confidential investigation, but people who had been there, those who had seen the impossible, knew the truth was far stranger than any report could explain. Dr. Chen never spoke about that day again. Whenever people asked, he would only smile faintly and shake his head, as though holding on to a secret too precious to share. In the quiet moments of his life, late at night when the world was still, he could still see the forest in his mind. He could still hear the whispers. And sometimes, when he closed his eyes, he could see Emma. Far away, deep in the heart of the hidden forest, Emma stood at the edge of a glimmering pool of water, her reflection staring back at her. The forest was alive around her, the wind soft, the trees swaying, the air humming with a peace she had never known. The animals were with her still, though not always in form. She could feel them as part of her now, their energy wrapped around her like a protective shield. She knelt by the pool, dipping her fingers into the cool water. As ripples spread outward, the reflection changed. For a brief moment, she saw the world she had left behind, the sterile lights of the hospital, Dr. Chen's tired face, the fear and confusion that had surrounded her. But the vision faded as quickly as it came, replaced by the soft glow of the forest once more. "This is where I'm meant to be," she whispered, her voice carrying softly across the clearing. A gentle breeze brushed against her face, rustling the leaves above her. The forest seemed to answer, its presence wrapping around her like an embrace. The mark on her hip glowed faintly, a quiet reminder of what she was: a bridge, a vessel, a guardian of something ancient and beautiful. She didn't understand everything yet, she didn't need to. Somewhere deep in her heart, Emma knew that the balance had been restored. The world would continue turning, nature would thrive, and life would go on. She was part of it now, woven into the fabric of something much greater than herself. And for the first time in her life, Emma was at peace. She stood, her gaze lifting toward the silver sky above. The whispers were gone now, replaced by a deep, unshakable stillness. The forest was quiet, waiting, watching. Emma smiled, turning back toward the path that led deeper into the woods. The animals were there, waiting for her: the fox, the wolf, the leopard. They moved with her as she walked, their presence a constant comfort, their steps in perfect rhythm with her own. And together, they disappeared into the trees, the forest closing gently behind them.